Hello, and welcome to Ipsa Dixit, a podcast on legal scholarship. I'm your host, Brian L. Fry, Spears Gilbert Associate Professor of Law at the University of Kentucky College of Law. My guest is Jessica Silbey, Professor of Law and Co-Director of the Center for Law Innovation and Creativity at Northeastern University School of Law. We will discuss her essay, Photocopier, which will be included in the book, A History of Intellectual Property in 50 Objects, which will be published by Cambridge University Press. So welcome to the show, Jessica.
Thank you.
Great. So I was wondering if you could start by just telling listeners a little bit about the book project as a whole and how you came to get involved in it.
Sure. Well, Cloudy and Dan, Cloudy Opdenkamp and Dan Hunter approached me to write a chapter for the book. And there are 50 chapters in the book, but I didn't know that when they asked me. And at first I sort of groaned. I think a lot of us, we have a lot of things on our plate and we like to do things for our friends. And I just wasn't sure whether this was something that I could do. And then when they described the project to me, I have to say I got very excited. So the book is an opportunity to introduce to non-lawyers, but people who are interested in contemporary culture, all the ways that intellectual property is relevant in their lives in unexpected ways through investigation of particular objects. So the soccer ball, for example, or the light bulb, or Mattel's Barbie, or the corset, or in my case, the photocopy machine. So each short chapter is written by a different scholar in a very accessible way, sort of not academic prose as much as sort of mini histories of the object to show how intellectual property law intervened in its production and cultural importance.
So you wrote about the photocopier. How did you come to write about that particular object? Did Cloudy and Dan ask you to write about the photocopier, or was that something you suggested, or some combination of the two?
Yeah, so they suggested it to me. And at first I thought, I wrote back and said, I would love to hear more and why the photocopier? And I think it was Dan who wrote back and said, well, the photocopier is such an interesting, productive machine. Like it is, I can't exactly remember what he said exactly, but it was something about how, it's for everyday use. And you are the kind of person who writes about intellectual property for everyday users. And so I think he was appealing to my own intellectual interests about how intellectual property facilitates or doesn't facilitate everyday creativity and innovation. So I think that's why he sort of assigned it to me.
So the photocopier, I mean, it's such a familiar object, at least from my youth. It's like hard to imagine it not always existing in some way. But like, so through your research and through writing about the photocopier, like what did you find out about who invented the photocopier as we know it today and sort of what they were responding to? Like what was the motivation for it?
Sure. So when I was assigned this chapter and I started digging in, one of the first things I did, as many professors do, is get some help. So I'm going to call out my research assistant at this moment and say Scott McFall was an extraordinarily excellent research assistant. And he and I dug up, and then we talked together a bunch of research on the origins of the photocopy machine. So it does have an origin, at least the way we understand the photocopy machine, which is called the Xerox machine. Chester Carlson is identified as the inventor of the Xerox machine. And he was a guy that was born in 1906 in Washington State. And he was working class, supporting his parents even through high school. There was illness in his family. And scrabbled his way to New York to go to night school, law school at night, New York Law School, actually. worked in the patent office in PR Mallory and Company, which is a manufacturer of electric components. He's sort of making his way as a young professional who interested in science, interested in chemistry. And he actually had this problem that he had on a regular basis, which was through studying at night and his work during the day, his hand was cramping all the time from writing notes on all the work that he was doing. And he dreamed of a way to make that more easy, actually. So it was through everyday work and the challenges of the work he was doing, the copying of the notes for the patents and his law studies, that he sort of dreamed up the idea of an automatic copying machine.
It's so funny. It's like so much of invention seems to come from people kind of in identifying a problem in their lives and asking, like, what would a solution to this problem look like?
Yeah. I mean, so many inventors describe, actually artists describe this too, that problem solving or identifying a need is one of the primary motivations or incentives for creating or inventing new things. It's true.
So is this something Carlson did on his own, or were there other people involved? And sort of what was the origin story of the technology in question?
Yeah. So one of the reasons I really loved working on this short chapter is I thought the story of the photocopier embodied so many productive tensions that are in intellectual property generally, between ownership and exclusivity and access and copying, for example. And the origin of the photocopier embodies this tension, not only because he is the inventor, he is the named inventor on the patent. And I think we can call him that fairly. The major Xerox machine that became very, very popular has his name on the patent, but he worked with other people to reduce it to practice and to commercialize it. So he worked in actually his home laboratory was in Astoria in Queens, which was actually it was like in the garage. This is like he was one of the garage inventors, with a guy named Otto Cornet, who was a young German physicist, and together they made the first effective reduction to practice of a xerographic copy on a piece of wax paper, which is today displayed in the Smithsonian Museum of American History. And so he and Otto Cornet together actually originated the first implementation of the photocopier, but also the commercialization of it happened with Battelle Memorial Institute, which is a private nonprofit research company, and Haloid Company, which was a Rochester-based photo paper company that later became Xerox. And so the three of them, Chet, Carlson, and these two companies, Battelle and Haloid, actually shared in the commercialization upside of the photocopy machine, the Xerox machine. Otto Cornet left early and went to work for IBM, as it turns out, who later sued Haloid, or Haloid sued IBM, I think, in an interesting ironic twist of fate. But it was a joint project. There was major collaboration, even though Chet Carlson, I think, is seen as the originator.
Yeah, and you suggest in the essay that they were like drawing on earlier work as well, as so many inventors do.
Yeah, there was a guy, Paul Seleni, who was a Hungarian physicist whose research papers Chet had been studying to the information and the chemical processes. And Paul Seleni has been called the father of xerography, actually, but didn't come up with the machine itself.
Yeah. So one of the things I really enjoyed in the essay was this sort of irony you point out between this sort of the nature of the patent claims around the photocopier technology and the nature of or purpose of the underlying invention itself. I wonder if you could talk about that a little bit.
Right. So the machine that facilitated massive copying, and one could say copyright infringement, actually, is itself protected through patent law and was not allowed itself to be copied for decades, right? So there's this, the 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 exclusivity over the machine is one thing, but what the machine facilitates, which is rampant and productive or consumptive copying, which is a different kind of infringement possibly, is another thing. And I thought that was too delicious not to point out.
So to the extent you were able to identify this in your research, like what kind of uses did Carlson initially anticipate for the photocopy machine? Like sort of what problem or problems was he most intent on solving? And like, to what extent did he anticipate how people would ultimately use the device that he shepherded into the world?
Well, it's the information that we have about him describes him very much hoping that the machine would be used for educational and research purposes, that it would be a supplement to the kind of progress that we typically imagine intellectual property is supposed to promote. It was going to help people learn, and it was going to help people do more research or generate new ideas. So he was imagining exact copying, but exact copying that was an intermediary for other creative work. I think he did not, there's no evidence that he thought that it was going to replace published books in the marketplace, for example, or that it was going to cut into revenue for photography, for example. That there's no evidence of that at all. So he was really thinking of it as an aid, as a tool for creativity and innovation.
Right. And so today, I mean, like I said earlier, I feel like it's so easy to take photocopy technology so much for granted. But I wonder if you could talk a little bit about the sort of social impact of the introduction of low cost reproduction via photocopier in the moment. Like, how did it affect sort of how people thought about copying, reproduction, publication? And you even talk a little bit about the practice of law and sort of how the photocopier affected the practice of law.
Well, right. So, I mean, in that last point, the lawsuit between IBM and Xerox was a notoriously contentious one, and the volume of discovery in that lawsuit is emblematic of what we see today. Well, now we see it's all digital, but can you imagine what discovery would look like before there was a photocopy machine? I mean, if the fact that you can make copies of so many different papers and then throw thousands of boxes at your adversaries changes the nature of litigation. I mean, just completely changes the nature of litigation. So there were other, when you look at the social impact of photocopying, there's all sorts of very interesting things you find. So one example that comes up in a lot of books on popular culture and American culture is shopping lists. And so when you're registered for a wedding, it used to be that you would, you'd go around and take notes, or the notes would be in the shop itself. But there are these funny little vignettes about how being able to hand out the things you want on your registry to other people through the photocopy machine facilitated a whole industry of showers and wedding registries and things like that. That is, being able to make lists and distribute the lists very easily changed the administration of certain social activities. So that was unexpected. I just wasn't not being of that world, really. And there are people, of course, who make art with photocopiers. You can search that online. And the political uses of photocopiers are also pretty rampant. I mean, the idea of making copies of a flyer and putting it all over your community makes public expression and political expression that much easier.
Yeah, I mean, in a lot of ways, I couldn't help but think that like the social impact of reducing the cost and difficulty of reproducing and sort of facilitating the dissemination of works of various kinds in a lot of ways was sort of like almost like an echo or like a anticipation of the kinds of social changes that we saw with the internet, like kind of like creating these potential network effects that hadn't previously been possible for people who hadn't previously been able to take advantage of them.
Yeah. Well, certainly both the downside and the upside. I mean, if you, I mean, the debate about the VCR in the 80s about whether this machine was going to replace movies um, and kill Hollywood, for example, or whether it was going to be just a totally new industry and that we were going to have different opportunities and more opportunities to experience movies. It's the same kind of question. Every device, every copying device that is brought online, VCR wasn't online, but now we have, TiVo, the MP3 player, but now we have all sorts of, online listening devices. I mean, all of these have origins in the copy machine of some kind. I mean, and we can also talk about photography being an early form of a copy machine too, but a different kind entirely. So yeah, it promotes a lot of progress, but it also cuts into markets that are established and fought over.
Like a really any kind of disruptive technology, it seems like sort of forces established market relationships or market actors to sort of renegotiate what their role, if any, is in the sort of new equilibrium, as it were.
Yeah, and there's so much fighting to maintain one's status or position in the market. And I think one of the things that intellectual property challenges us to think hard about is how evolution off one's privileged position of market dominating space is just the nature of things. Like you only get a patent for so long, copyright is supposed to expire, for example, so these things, they're supposed to give way to other things. But it's hard to give those things up, for sure. But all technology is supposed to evolve.
Right. Right. Well, so in the course of your research into the photocopier, was there anything that you found that you really liked or enjoyed or wanted to include but weren't able to fit into the essay itself?
Well, that's a good question. I mean, the law professor in me wanted to talk about all the cases about photocopiers. There are so many, and they have interesting characters, and you can always tell pretty interesting David Goliath stories or stories about universities or publishing companies. So there are a whole bunch of cases that I was interested in but didn't really put in. So things like that. But one of the benefits of being forced to write a 5-page essay for a popular audience is that you really do distill it to the things that should be said and leave out all the other stuff.
Yeah. So how about that? I mean, what was the experience of writing this essay as compared to sort of the more typical law review format that we write in? I mean, I know that you're really prolific and you've worked in a lot of different areas, but I wonder sort of like how the experience of writing for in this particular format for this particular audience was different and how you approached it.
Yeah, well, I think I'm so glad that I was asked to do it, and I'm glad that Dan pushed me because it was fun, and it's liberating in many ways. And frankly, as a teacher, not only as a legal scholar, you want to be able to reach as many different kinds of people as possible. That is, you want to figure out how to cultivate a diverse audience, and this it was, you write shorter sentences, you maybe exaggerate just a little bit more to make a point. I think you don't have to have I mean, as I try to be objective and accurate, but you can also have a sort of a pretty clear view or positioning in the world. And so that's fun too. So I really enjoyed it. And I frankly, I hate writing law review articles. I'll just say that. And I'm working on my another book right now. And in many ways, I think the more and more I write books, the more I am just drawn to that voice, the sort of a broader voice.
So one of the things I like about the intellectual history of intellectual property and 50 objects book in general, and your essay in particular, is the kind of choice and use of images. And I wonder if you could talk a little bit about that, like sort of what role, if any, did you have in selecting the images, and sort of what were the thoughts there?
So when I submitted the essay, I submitted all the underlying material for the essay. So there were a lot of footnotes that they took out, for example, and I had a lot more sources that were not cited. And much of the images came from those sources. So the only image that I can't remember whether the image that they included, which is of a face pressed up against a photocopy machine plate, I don't know if we ever young and played with the photocopy machines and like took pictures of your hand, took pictures of your cheek, My children take pictures of all different body parts, So there's one image in the book of a face pressed up against a plate. I don't remember that being in the materials that I sent, but the image of Patty Hill installing her art show called Common Objects, which are photocopy images of common objects, for example, that was in one of the pieces that I sent them. And also the first electrostatic Xerox print, which is in the Smithsonian National Museum of History, American History, was also in one of the sources that I sent them.
So Jessica, in closing, a lot of your work has dealt with similar subject matter, including a lot of work on photography in many different registers. And I wonder if you could talk a little bit about sort of the work you're doing in that area in a general sense, and how this essay on the history of the photocopier might have intersected with some of your work, some of your other scholarship.
Yeah. So, I spend a lot of time doing research in practice communities, digital photographers, for example, sculptors, bench scientists in pharmaceutical companies. I mean, I go to those places and study the people who are doing that work and collect information, observational information, interview information, things like that. So empirical work in a qualitative nature. And I do that in order to figure out how the law, broadly construed, patent law or copyright law or trademark law or whatever, is infiltrating or acts in their life. So instead of thinking about law from what I would think of as the inside out, the statutes and the court cases and the lawyers, that being the inside realm of law, and thinking how does that project out into the world, I'm studying the law as it's instantiated by everyday creative and innovative practices on the ground. And I do that, one, because it's not done very often, and I think it's important. I think it's important to figure out how sort of the elite formal area of law lives elsewhere, where most of us live, actually. I think that's important information to gather and to understand. But also as a reform project, I think intellectual property generally is pretty out of touch with everyday creative and innovative practices. And if we think that it needs to be changed to address real needs in those fields, I think we need to figure out how those fields work to promote the kind of differences that we think law should promote. And so this project, I'm doing a big project on digital photography right now. It's going to be part of a new book that I'm writing. Also work I'm doing with Eva Subotnik and Peter DeCola. But this particular chapter was sort of a mini exercise in that, how did the formal intellectual property patent right come out of this very complicated and interesting story about Chet Carlson and all his collaborators and business partners, and what was its effect in everyday life.
Cool. Well, I hope we can have you back on the podcast to talk about one of your new academic projects in photography as well.
Oh, I would love to do that. I would really love it. Thanks for having me.
Okay. Cool. Well, thanks so much for coming on the show. It's been really fun talking to you about this cool project. And like everyone else, I'm looking forward to seeing the final book.
Yeah, me too.
Just an old abandoned shell. What a story it could tell. Where once 1,000 dreams a day went quickly on their way. Where little boys with dreams so sweet would sit upon the trainman's seat. Once used to stand in awestruck wonder, while down below they felt the thunder of 1,000,000 tons of steel and track. Its stillness hangs so heavily, the walls cry out our history. Its greatness begs to stand today, but they won't listen to what we say. For generations it will speak of wars, of peace, of crowded seas, of apple butchers and lovely scenes, smiling red caps, black limousine, and yellow taxis standing in a row.
Yellow taxis standing in a row.
My friends, will we eventually put the record's ball to all we see? Because it's old to you and me, seeing it what we may someday be. And will we too eventually wipe out our past as hurriedly? Will things we did go totally unnoticed by the people that we see? Not a single memory to share. Lovely murals fall before progress, wrecking ball. Remember what I tried to say. It can't return once it's done away. And faded photos just won't do. The future of the past is up to you. What a shame if she should fall. We'll have just the memories and friends, that's all. And not one child will ever stand in awe and wonder about that brand new parking lot.